Hello, 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 Reza. How are you?
I'm good, Shay. How are you doing?
I am good. I am good. Excited to jump into episode 5 of Future Forward.
Yeah, me too. Today's topic is going to be great. I think we've talked about energy, we talked about electricity last time, but now we're sort of digging into something that I think all of us can relate to, which is transportation.
Yes,
All of us have to get
absolutely.
to places. That's like I
Yes.
think that's part of being human these days is we got to get somewhere. Well, we no longer on villages where, we can just sort of stay within the 150 people tribe that we're in. We now have cities. There's transportation that's needed. I can't wait to talk about this, Jay. So let's start with let's start at the start like we always do.
Yes, let's do that. And for our new listeners, welcome to Future Forward, which is a conversation that Reza and I have been having for years now, and we're bringing you in. We're talking about the future of cities, and every week, every episode, we take a chunk of the city, the interconnected systems of cities, and we dive deep into one. And as Reza just said, we're diving into the future of transportation today. In making your intro point, Reza, you highlighted where this whole transportation thing started. We did not have long distances to go, and consequently, transportation was really human energy on your 2 feet walking from one place to another, whether it be within your community or because we lived in more agricultural or hunter-based societies. We walked wherever
Yeah,
we had to go. And then we moved to using animals to transport ourselves or to do labor on our farms. But it's always been, and this is why I love the fact we cover cities. It's always been this tie-in. Transportation is literally the use of energy
hmm
to move people and things from one place to the other.
yeah, yeah. It's amazing. So give us a little bit about like where this all started, Jay.
Yeah. So the transport systems as we know it now started with the invention of the steam engine in the late 18th century. Once we figured out steam engines, the first place we really used it for transportation was in trains. As we started to the engineering of our transport systems led us to the automobile, essentially, which is sort of the next phase. And we all think a lot about the Model T Ford. It's kind
Yeah,
of the most
classic.
the classic, yeah. It brought vehicular transportation into the hands of the people.
Yeah.
And consequently, it is that critical piece of the transportation systems because once cars came in, even the little trolleys that were used in some cities at that point had to make way for
hmm
cars. We have these images of cities like in California where you had trolleys going through those old pictures, and the next thing you see is those streets have become designed for cars. So I have some data points I'll share here. The Model T was introduced in 1908, and by 1927, Ford had produced over 15 million models. Yeah,
That's
it's
crazy.
pretty wild. And between 1913 and 2019, we went from having 181,000 miles of paved roads in the US to 4.1 million miles of paved roads. We wholly changed our landscape by adapting to the car.
That's staggering.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
staggering. Yeah.
It's it's pretty astonishing. Consequently, obviously, it was the internal combustion engine that led us to the development of the automobile, and we ended up starting what we all now know as I'll say a decline into just using petroleum at scale and fossil
Mm-hmm.
fuels at scale. And petroleum became the dominant form of fuel for transportation, both with trains, but also with vehicle transportation in cities, cars, and the like. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's interesting, Shay. Like, I have one thread to pull over there. I know you have one more point to make on, this past, but it seemed like when we started with transportation, we had a form of public transportation with trains. But the
Mhm.
moment that cars came about, it sort of atomized it down to like, as an individual, now I can move myself around as opposed to relying on something to move me.
Mhm.
And I think there's the good and bad of that, like of two sides of the same coin. Gave us freedom, but at the same time, like created all this situation with fossil fuels and transportation, just our landscape, our lives, the climate, but at the same time giving us all this freedom to move and make cities thrive in the way that they do now. So interesting how that always seems to play out with every introduction of new technology.
Of new technology. You are so correct. So there's this fantastic book that I'll recommend to our listeners. It's called Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet by an author called Goldfarb.
Mm,
And in that book, he talks about how we've literally changed the fabric of our cities because we moved from rail to the point you're making, rail to individual transportation in cars,
yeah,
and we had to build the roads
yeah,
to enable that movement. And in some cases, we literally built those roads right next to the rail we put down.
yeah,
So we went from moving a lot of people in one vehicle, which is what a
mm,
train is, to individualized transportation modes, which I guess it goes back to this independence thing
mm,
of maybe I'll say America more than most. Other countries
yeah,
obviously have cars, but I lived in London, and for a good chunk of my time in London, I did not own a car.
mm.
For years, I did not
And that
own a
was
car,
possible.
and it
That
was
was possible.
possible. And I lived
Yeah,
what was would consider a fairly decent life because I could
yeah,
go places, meet friends, walk to places, uh, and moving to the US was such a shock for me.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I can imagine.
Even in a place like Chicago, where the train system is fairly decent, I
Yeah,
was still having to drive so much, and then you can't even imagine. I'm still recovering, having
yeah. So I think you have one more thing about the past, and then let's bring us into the present. I think this is an interesting point that you're going to bring up, like where the past was with transportation.
yes. So we again, just last point on how much road we've had to build. 48,000 miles of interstate U.S. highway, which was launched in 1956 to start to move us between cities. So
Ooh, wow.
yeah, it's kind of wild. And
Yeah.
around the late 19th century, we started to push. People started to push again. We find this overlap between other systems in our cities where it became this push towards electrifying everything. Because
Mm,
last episode we were talking about um, Edison, Volta, and
hmm.
the move towards electric power to convert to energy for all the activities. That also touched the transportation sector. Where it landed, where it really took off was more trains and trolleys in cities. Again, those mass movement options started to adopt electrification well before what now feels like a lot of move towards electric vehicles. Couldn't get that move in electric vehicles because the infrastructure wasn't there, the battery technology wasn't quite there yet, and consequently, it kept stalling. The towards electrification of vehicles kept stalling, and we find ourselves here today. Yeah.
Yeah. So what? Yeah. Take us into the present. Like, what's going on in transportation today? Especially, I'm curious about like why is electrification now beginning to work?
Starting to pick up. Yeah. So as we keep finding with all these conversations, Reza, none of these other systems and the changes that were happening in these other systems, it wasn't just in that one system. The changes that we were seeing in our buildings, in our cities, and electrification of our buildings through light, and it obviously started to touch on vehicles as well. But the transportation sector has lagged behind immensely. It's still today, 90% of the energy used in the US, consumed in the US, is for transportation. Not just the movement of people, but the movement of things. And as we start to move away from internal combustion engines, because of, again, those same movements that started of people raising their hands and saying, why are we burning fossil fuels again? We're essentially burning the future of our kids. Let's move things around. Some of the technology, because electric vehicle technology has been around since, I believe, the 1970s or so. Today, we now have a lot more adoption. And I'd say, pull on the thread you pulled last week, it boiled down to touching the emotions and the minds of people to make them either desire electric vehicles or desire a better future through the reduction in the use of fossil fuels. So it all really boils down to how can we get people to think differently about the technologies we use. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember when the Toyota Prius came out and it was kind of a status symbol to drive a Prius because it was hybrid and, less energy use? I clearly remember that.
I do too. And it was celebrities who were making it cool to
That's
drive
it.
the Prius.
Yes.
I
Yes.
distinctly remember everyone seemed to have a conversation, anyone in the space anyway, had a conversation about Gwyneth Paltrow driving a Prius.
I
I'm
was
like,
trying to
what
remember.
is
I was
this?
trying to
Yeah, it
remember.
was
Yeah.
her.
Yeah.
I'm like, really? This is what will move us in this direction?
This boils down to like we're so human in
Yes.
how we adopt, new things. And so, one way is through this, social proof of celebrity adopting it, and then you feel like, oh, this must be a good thing. Flip side, like as we have begun this drive for electrification, one of the factors that's hindering it is this thing about range anxiety. And I think it might be
Yes.
only a US thing because there's such great distances. I don't know enough about other countries, maybe countries in
It's the
Europe where
same.
this might not. Oh, it is? Okay.
It's the
So this
same.
is
Yeah. It's the
okay.
same because range anxiety is tied to this perception that there are not enough charging stations,
Yeah.
regardless of the distance
Whether,
you're
yeah,
going.
yeah,
We see
yeah.
gas stations on the side of almost every other road,
Yes,
and you're
yes.
like, you
That
know
is
what, if I
just
have
like
a
it's
problem, I can
ubiquitous.
just exactly,
Yeah, it's
exactly.
ubiquitous. Yeah.
And range anxiety in the US is, yes, tied to long distances.
Mm,
In other places, like in Nigeria, for example, it is more an anxiety around, will I be able to charge
yes.
when I need to charge,
Yes.
regardless of the distance?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Makes sense. I can't imagine in Mumbai we'd have enough chargers for all the crazy amount of cars there. I
exactly.
try to imagine like, well, what's gonna happen in Mumbai when we have all those electric cars everywhere? I'm sure they'll solve that problem, but it just blows my mind when I think about it.
They'll figure it out, I hope.
Yeah, yeah,
And along those lines, we've seen a lot more adoption than at any point. So some stats in 2023, EV sales in the US passed 1 million units for the
wow.
first time. And as of the first half of 2024, we're in June 2024 now, EVs now represent just under 9%,
Mm.
8.6% of new vehicles sold. So there's still a ways to go,
Yeah,
but we've seen a lot more interest and modes and variations of electric vehicles. And I'll make another quick point about this. Some companies, Toyota being chief amongst them, were trying to push the hydrogen
hmm,
version of electric vehicles. So they did the hybrid, obviously the Prius, but they also started to go down this route of hydrogen fueled
yeah,
vehicles, and that stalled and continues to stall
yeah,
because, to your point, you're so spot on with your insights about people and anxieties. The real concern most had with that version of a more sustainable vehicle was that uh, the explosion of hydrogen
yeah.
in a tank in your car is something we all absolutely have no desire to experience.
So here's the thing, Jay. One of the most popular rock albums of all time, Led Zeppelin 4, is this big Zeppelin blowing up that indelibly is in my head when I think about hydrogen. So
And so,
I can
yeah,
imagine that
yeah,
that feeling of like this thing will explode. I don't know if I want it in my car.
that is not what you want. And
Yeah,
so we've seen that sort of branch of sustainability, the fuels that power our vehicles, our cars. We've seen that branch sort of fizzle out a lot
hmm,
more, but
yeah,
we're still seeing a lot of adoption of electric vehicles, especially in Europe, yes, but more
yeah,
so also in the US. I see more electric vehicles
yes,
around me here in Austin than at any
yes,
point
yes.
in the just under 10 years that I've lived here.
Yeah, yeah. And anywhere you go, it didn't used to be. You'd sort of see one or two a day, but now it's like you get out of the house, you go, you just gonna run into or see, not run into. Let's not say
Yeah.
that. But you're gonna see, a Tesla
Yes.
or one of the newer
Electric
you know
vehicles. Yeah.
one of the yeah, exactly. So I'll have to admit, that my kids have told me, both Ollie and Zal have told me that, Dad, your next car, you need to get an electric car. But I'm such a diehard. I love cars and I love, you know, the internal combustion engine.
Yes.
Because I've always, every car that I've had since I was, 16 has been a manual stick shift. I've
I
always had
love
that.
that. I love that.
And even the car that I have right now. And I always want that same, feeling of
The
driving.
feeling.
And
Yeah.
I've driven electric cars and they just feel like, I don't know, like toys or something.
Yeah.
They don't feel like a car. So I think I'll be the last, last diehard with an internal combustion engine. They'll have to pry it out of my dying hands. But I really enjoy driving, and so I'll be a late adopter. I'll be a late
You,
adopter.
but you could also just, because I know how you feel about sort of cities with public transport and the community that you can
Yeah.
sort of tap into in cities. Public transit systems are at a faster adoption rate for the electric vehicle
Mm,
future than
interesting.
individual cars. So
Interesting.
even if you don't own one for a while, you might jump on a train or a
I would
bus
love
in the
to. I
city
would love to.
that is fully electric vehicle
Yeah.
charged.
Yeah.
Some of your deliveries are now coming in electric vehicles too.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
the Rivian Amazon truck
exactly.
just
Exactly.
just came out a few hours ago. But yeah,
Exactly.
I think yes. I would love if there were like I would love in Austin for there to be more public transportation. I couldn't imagine a
Absolutely.
better way of getting around, at least for, many things that doesn't, that wouldn't require a car. Because I think transportation in some ways have had a huge impact in communities, and maybe we can sort of segue into talking about
Please,
that, Shay, because
please.
I think there's, with this, with this freedom and with everything that came with transportation, there's also been, because you touched on like how many roads we've built, you know, the big thing, and you see this in Austin, you see this in other cities, is that it has displaced communities.
Yes.
Roads have torn up places that used to be together. They
Yes.
have sort of decimated neighborhoods that used to be contiguous, and so and also it feels like cars disconnect you from your neighbors because you get in your car, pull out of your garage, and then go somewhere. You don't
Yes.
really interact as much as you would if you didn't have to do that. So that's like a thing that niggles at me. Like if I was going on public transportation, I would just be with people and I would
Yes.
feel like I'm part of a community and just be courteous to others. And at least
Yes.
I hope so. Being in New York City, being on a subway in New York City doesn't feel as good, but I don't know. There's something about feeling like, okay, well, I'm part of something bigger than just myself in my car,
Absolutely.
atomized, driving, and being angry at the other person that's not going fast enough. What do you
It's a
think of
it's
that,
a it's a
Shay?
really good point. It's a really good point. And before the conversation here, before we started recording, you'd mentioned a thing that I am quite keen for you to touch on, which is the economic impact of cars or not having cars. It's
Yeah,
such a big part of why I think our societies are fractured right now, if you want to
yeah.
dive into it a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's the second aspect. I believe this is sort of more true in the US, maybe than other places. I haven't experienced it in other places. As as cities grew, and as transportation became important, we displaced communities that were closer to city centers that were maybe not as economically well off further out. And the fact that they're further out and have to travel into places where they have to work, but they spend the most of their time transporting themselves there and needing a car to do it, just you know makes a stark difference between the haves and the have-nots even more.
Yes.
And especially like I know in a city like Austin, our public transportation is shit. I mean, it's not that
Yes.
good, you know.
Yes.
And so it is so hard. Like I know in the western parts of the city, they don't even want public transport out there. Well, how are people going to get out there to work at the HEB or to, I don't know, mow your lawn? Or of course they'll have trucks and stuff like that. But it just makes it even harder for the service economy to operate when transportation and public transportation is such a stark difference between like what people can do.
Yeah, you're correct. I'll use an example. Back when we we would drive to Dallas when we first moved to Austin,
Mm,
we would go past some parts of the city. You would see close to downtown, and you would see people sort of on the side of the main road waiting to jump on buses. And then a few years later, more recently, we'd be driving along those same roads, and communities
community.
have literally been walled off from downtown Dallas. And consequently, if you don't have
Hmm.
a car, and those buses, the routes have been reduced essentially. So if you
Or
don't have a car, whatever your job is downtown, you're not getting there in a good time, or it's going to cost you more. And so I'll make that one point. Second point I'll make, a good friend of mine, Mike Duffy, runs a company, and used to run a company. And one of the stats he shared with me was that the decline in a low income worker ability to earn and their lifestyle could be tracked or traced to the first vehicular fine they get. I'll
Whoa.
explain. If you take your car downtown, you barely get by. You take your car
Yes.
downtown, if you get a fine for either speeding or parking in the wrong place, you have to pay it by a certain time. As I mentioned, these are low-income workers in low-paid jobs. He told me that if they couldn't pay that fine, so let's say it's $100 fine, and they have to wait for payday, well, payday was never enough. So
Mm.
they defer the fine to pay for
I-
electricity or food. And the next action is to increase the fine, which worsens their
ah,
ability to pay. And then the next action is your vehicle gets impounded, which means they can no longer get to the job to earn the pay to pay those fines.
that's a spiral downwards. I mean,
It
that's
is.
just.
It is. In cities where, because he was working with cities across the US, in cities where the public transport systems were suboptimal, this story played out time and time and time again. And the innovation he came up with in one of his was to enable people to either challenge the fines based on their income levels and consequently do something else, maybe community service or something so that it's not a cash fine, it's an
Yeah.
act of service to your community, or defer it in some way, shape, or form. But it all ties back to access, economic
Mm.
access, and cars in our cities.
Mm. That's tough. So
It is,
yeah,
yeah.
I feel like we could go on about this, but Seyi, I'm now curious about the future.
The future, yes.
This is the favorite part of my episode. I'm curious to see, like, can we solve some of these problems? What's happening with transportation? Where are we going?
Yeah, so I think we started touching on it. I believe, based on research, based on just looking at history and how we got to where we are, the two trends that I believe are driving the future are public transportation systems and the electrification of those public transportation systems. So we have, I'll geek out a little on something my oldest son, absolutely loves. He was the first one who brought to my attention the maglev train in
Mm.
China that goes from the Shanghai International Airport to, I think, Longjiang Road Station, which is a
Mhm.
30-kilometer distance that is
Mm.
achieved in 8 minutes.
What?
Yes,
My God.
max speed, max speed of 431 kilometers per hour, which is like 268 miles per hour,
That's
eight
crazy.
minutes. And if you imagine those sort of systems in rail systems in cities across the US, because
Hmm.
one of the problems we just identified is the sprawl that we've
Yeah.
ended up with, and the distance between where we live, the distances between where we live and where we work. I think combining transportation, mass transportation through rail and electrified public transit, we could totally address these problems. Even the build
Yeah.
out would be jobs.
Yeah.
We can power them through some of the renewable energy options we talked about last week.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we can start to like bring people together to rebuild our communities, even as we all go from work to home. Instead of, one of the things that I'm struggling with is Austin expanding I-35. For those of you who don't know, I-35 is the through line from that connects several cities in Texas, and there's some expansion going on in downtown Austin. I was really hoping we would get a rail system.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
We still
You know,
can. Yeah.
yeah, love your optimism, Shay, but here's like my here are two things that I'm grappling with. One is
Yeah.
um Austin's been through sort of this light rail light rail train type of stuff. We just barely didn't pass the light rail, you know, vote. I think more than a decade ago. That was such a miss, and now it's too late. And I think with public transport in the U.S., it's a question of who pays for it. Like no
Yes.
one wants to pay for it, and so that becomes a real challenge. What
Yes.
I'm most curious about is like I am thinking about, okay, how can are there solutions where there is less individual need for my car, but there's a multiple ways of creating mobility that is a combination of sort of mass mobility and individual mobility, but I wouldn't have to own the car. I know that we have like Ubers and things like that. But I don't know at
What
what
is
point
the middle
where we
point?
get to where, yeah, that's kind of a middle point, but we get to a point where I just need to go somewhere, I get into something and go, and there are multiple modes of doing it. I don't know, maybe that's
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a fully formed thought, but I'm curious if we have a much more flexible way of using this transportation system, which right now, it's never enough for the peak, and it's too available for everyone to misuse it.
Yes. So there are cities, I think what you're alluding to is like multimodal transportation systems
Yeah,
in cities.
yeah,
And the US has never, maybe New York,
yeah,
because
yeah,
you can get on a bus. The route or the size of the bus
yeah,
is based on the density and the
yeah,
number of people that the planners have figured out will get on that bus. But your bus is really just to take you to the train station, which gets you a 5 minute walk from where you're trying to get to.
right.
The combination of this unwillingness to accept things like there's this idea called I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, braces paradox, which
Mm,
America always seems to ignore, which is this idea that we think there's so many cars on the road, let's add more roads, as if
mm-hmm.
that will
Yes.
reduce the number of cars. That's
No,
kind of not how it works.
yeah. It just increases demand. That's all
It
it
just
does.
increases demand when what we should do is increase those modes. I totally agree with
Yes.
you. Increase
Yes.
the mode so that the car is not the first option. And I believe the
Yes.
future, when we can get leaders who are both, who are not worried about getting into office based on platitudes to certain groups, but
Mm-hmm.
actually planning our cities to serve all of us, I think we will get there. I'm an optimist. You said it. I'm an optimistic
Yeah.
realist. And part of it
Yeah.
is because I've lived in places where this
Mm.
was the case.
Yes.
It was the
Yeah.
case. I lived on the east end of London, and at some point, I got a job on the west end of London. And I would walk to the bus stop. The bus would take me a few stops to the train station. I'd get on the train, and I distinctly remember watching Samurai Jack on my iPod and a bunch of movies as well. And I started to know and meet the people who had the same routine as I did. It was amazing.
What
I
a
got
great
to know
story.
my neighbors
Yeah.
because we were all getting to the bus stop around the same time, even if we took
Yeah.
different trains.
Yeah.
And if we want to build our communities back in the US, I truly think the electrification of public transportation
Yeah.
and increased public transportation have to be more of an action plan than more roads.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love that call to action. I love your optimism as always, Shay.
I'll touch on one thing, and then we can sort of wrap it up. The there's this movement again, which I kind of find a bit silly, towards these electric vehicle takeoff and landing, like single person X for
Mm-hmm.
city travel. I think it's dumb. Genuinely think it's dumb, but we won't touch on that this week because it falls under some of these this movement, a third trend, which is around smart mobility and autonomy in cities that I think we've decided will make its own full episode.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, my one comment about these electric liftoff vehicles is, I guess it's just our fantasy of being Iron Man and being able to fly around. I too agree. That's a dumb idea. Like we're moving one person around in this flying vehicle. But yeah, that sounds like really attractive, but also just so wasteful. So
It is. It is.
yeah, so I'm curious. I think that's a great topic for us next time because I think there's more there. I feel
Yes,
like every time that we talk, we sort of uncover a topic that we need
absolutely.
to dig into in our next
Absolutely.
episode. So
Yeah.
yeah, I can't wait to do that, Jay.
That's awesome. So yeah, that brings us to the end of this episode on transportation, and we now know what our next episode will be. I'll share a stat. We hit three figures in terms of subscribers across the platforms after last week's
Woohoo!
episode. So
Yeah, man,
we're
this
slowly
is
getting
great.
up there. It is. It
Three
is. Thanks so
figures.
much for
Like,
listening.
yes, that's awesome. Like and
Yes.
subscribe.
Like and subscribe. And so on that note, we'll say thanks for listening. Please reach
Yes,
out, share with one person,
that's it.
and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.